It's perhaps kind of impressive just how quickly Games Workshop has managed to rival ABMech for a disappointing Codex in 10th edition. Now we know the full information including points for the Dark Angels release, let's see how their units are stacking up. Spoiler alert, it's not great. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Dark Angels points, and I must admit, as you can probably tell by the thumbnail, I really don't think they've done very well with this, and there's probably going to be a lot of Unforgiven collectors out there who are pretty disappointed that they've not done more with their Codex. I think in terms of optimal builds, you could perhaps argue that Index Dark Angels might have genuinely had more interest. So far for the story of the Dark Angels Codex, the rules have been known for quite some time now thanks to it coming out in the Deathwing Assault box set, but it was kind of annoying as we were sort of in a halfway house sort of state of affairs. We knew all the new rules, but we didn't know any of the points. The printed ones are entirely redundant in 10th edition codexes, so we're basically waiting until Games Workshop revise the munitorum field manual, which it seems they don't want to do until the actual codex full release drops, so we've waited quite a while for these. Just in terms of reaction to the rules changes from the Codex though, Dark Angels players were already really quite downbeat about that. It was pretty disappointing not to see any sort of changes or updates to the Unforgiven task force, which while it's not unusable at a casual level, is just flat weaker than a number of the more generic Space Marine detachments, which maybe isn't really all that much fun for the flavour for the chapter. And going through the datasheets, while there were a few positives here and there were some really quite painful nerfs. Maybe the most notable ones being Lionel Johnson losing his -1 to wound rule, the Deathwing Knights getting less damage on their melee weapons, and the Landspeeder Vengeance having its big gun downgraded for some reason, despite not being in any way overpowered. I must admit, I did think that it was a bit premature to get quite so disappointed by the rules for the Codex without the context of points. At the point of the rules being revealed, we didn't know if some of the units could be genuinely some of the strongest units in Warhammer 40k for all we knew at that point. If they costed them fairly low, then that could have been the case. And even though a couple of things had lost a bit of flavour, some things had gained a bit, I still think that there was enough stuff to keep them interesting, provided they had the right points cost. Unfortunately though, it does seem that just about every bit of salt was thoroughly justified, as Games Workshop have now unleashed Munitorum Field Manual 1.7, the points have been revealed for the Dark Angels players, and unfortunately it's really not that good. The vast majority of the points were the exact same as the ones prior to the update. They've just added in the disappointing cost for the Inner Circle companions who are kind of bad, plus the enhancements, taken out the units that got removed, and given them one nerf to the Ravenwing Command Squad, which was looking like quite an interesting unit. The problem with this is that given that plenty of the units got big nerfs in the Codex, quite a lot of things just desperately needed some fairly significant points decreases to actually get good. There's just a surprising amount of things here that are actively terrible in game now, as opposed to being just sort of kind of underwhelming. I feel like it's going to make a lot of players pretty uninspired by the army. GW have essentially delivered a fairly bland codex. The only real element of excitement, I think, were the Ravenwing and Deathwing detachments, which admittedly do add a bit of interest. They're just a kind of reliant on certain datasheets being good to actually get good themselves. But then they followed up a somewhat bland codex with datasheets being pretty bad in game, the vast majority fairly underpowered, and Azrael kind of still weirdly undercosted compared with other things pretty much auto-include in every Dark Angels list. Maybe seems that their Azrael and Ironstorm list, or Azrael and other generic Codex detachments, still could be one of the best ways to play. I feel like it's just kind of frustrating when I feel like myself or just about your average 40k player could have done a better job than Games Workshop, just with a few rough rules of thumb and comparing their units to the versions in generic Codex Space Marines. Let's go through their units bit by bit though. First up we've got the Deathwing Terminators and Deathwing Knights. The Deathwing Knights are 235. That's the same as they were pre-Codex, except you can't take units of 10 anymore. The damage on their weapons went down a bit, and both the swords and the maces seem at least somewhat balanced against a lot of targets. I'd probably lean towards the swords myself. When I did a community poll, people thought that a cost around about 215 points could have made them kind of interesting. That way there'd be a genuinely very, very tanky Terminator squad that doesn't have quite as much damage as your average one, but looks like they're remaining at 235 and therefore a bit niche. The standard Deathwing Terminator squad is 190 or 380, again same as it was before, a 5-point upgrade over the standard one, and I feel like at that kind of cost, if you were playing a standard Terminator squad, then these guys would likely be worth the upgrade. You do get the Watcher in the Dark for the once per game mortal wound thing and ignoring modifiers, both of which are good things, and I think that between them they're worth the extra 5. Could be interesting if you did want to try and make that Deathwing detachment work with their teleporting tricks. Still though, for the core Space Marine Codex, Terminators aren't really considered good now. I still feel to make them exciting for Space Marines, you need both these guys and the regular Terminator squad to go down in cost. Next up, we've got the Lion and the Inner Circle Companions, two other units that I feel like people are really quite interested to see get good. The Lion remains at his 350 points, and that really is a shame for him given that he wasn't being played competitively at 350, despite having his -1 to wound roll attached there. Now he just flat up lost that, with him not being able to turn on the Emperor's Shield once more. And as a result, I feel like he's just overcosted at 350 points. It's not awful in terms of damage and defense, but I feel like you need more than that when you're spending this many points on one model. Unlike Gilliman, who has at least fairly similar damage and defensive style stats, he doesn't add big buffs to the rest of the army. I feel like he could go down very significantly, probably something like 300 points would be a good start at the least. Out of all of the points cost, the Inner Circle Companions maybe feel like they're the single worst choice that Games Workshop made. It seems that they're unfortunately keeping their Codex printed cost at 105 points per 3 or 210 per 6, which just in no way seems balanced with their abilities. They're kind of on similar sorts of levels to Blade Guard, not having the invulnerable save or having as much AP, but they do gain at least some interesting rules to balance that out a bit. I honestly think to be an interesting unit in game, you'd have to have them cheaper than Blade Guard, which are 90 points currently. And at that kind of points cost, Blade Guard aren't even considered a standout unit for Space Marines, so I feel like something like 85 points per 3 of these guys would have been the absolute minimum to make them kind of interesting competitively. I feel that they're kind of a shame given that they're some really quite fun models. Fingers crossed they attract a bit of attention in whatever balance pass comes next. Next up, we've got the Ravenwing Bikers. The Black Knights retain their 90 points per 3 points cost. I still feel like these guys are perhaps some of the more interesting units out of the Dark Angels Codex right now. Given their speed and plasma damage, and their not even terrible durability for their cost, I feel like they are pretty interesting. A company of hunters could deliver them to do some big alpha strikes, or you could have interesting things like the Gladius Fire Discipline on them if you wanted, if you weren't going to use that on aggressors or something. It's a kind of pricey unit that you need to play with carefully, but maybe a bit more interesting than some here. As mentioned, the one nerf to the Codex since the last set of points were the Ravenwing Command Squad, unfortunately though. These guys went up from 110 points to 130 points. A bit disappointing given that at least a few people were interested in using these guys. I feel like 130 points still isn't actually terrible for what they bring. They give some good boost to their entire unit, plus 3 extra biker bodies with a bunch of plasma talons, and can lead a really quite big unit and get enhancements in that. I still feel like they could be interesting enough overall, though obviously a 20-point tax isn't great for them. For the Ravenwing vehicles, the planes aren't utterly abysmal, though I certainly wouldn't say they stand out compared with all the good standard Space Marine vehicles, the Dark Talons 210 and the Nephilim Jet Fighters 195. And one of the big losers from the Codex was the Land Speeder Vengeance. This one had its Plasma Storm battery dropped from damage 3 down to damage 2, and it seems that all it got in return for that was a very small points decrease. I feel like if you wanted to make this thing good with its new profile, it'd be wanting a points cost more like the 100 point sort of mark. This one needed an absolutely massive points cut to get it good again, and needless to say, it didn't receive one. Otherwise though, its partner in crime, the Landspeeder Dark Shroud, isn't awful, 115 points for its aura of stealth and cover. That is something that you can't pick up from the standard Space Marine Codex. It does seem to be getting at least some play in that Dark Angels Ironstorm list that I mentioned. Kind of nice to have that sort of defensive reliability on things like Dreadnought stomping forward, or even Storm Ravens delivering Dreadnoughts and Azrael, which recently seems to have been the flavour of the month for Dark Angels builds. Feels like at least the Dark Shroud is costed at a point where it's interesting enough to see play. Then finally for the actual miniatures, we get on to characters, where again I feel like things are just horribly unbalanced between Azrael and everyone else as they were before. Azrael still remains 105 points, still absolutely auto-include in every single Dark Angels optimised list at that cost I think. He grabs a 4+ invulnerable save and sustained hits to his unit, which are 2 very nice damage and defensive buffs to start with, has his own melee stats, and a Watcher in the Dark to protect against mortal wounds, and perhaps most importantly of all, he farms 1 command point per turn, giving you more stratagems for more big swings in game. If anything, I feel like he's a model that Dark Angels players might not have actually minded having his points increased on him too much, provided it was balanced out by the other characters going down in cost to make them just a little bit more interesting in comparison. I feel like having any one model of this auto-include just isn't particularly great for the faction, and it's better to have a bit more variety. Otherwise, for the rest of them, Belial's 85, not awful, but that precision that he grants to his squad isn't relevant in every game, maybe makes him a bit more questionable versus the other Terminator characters. Asmodai's 70 and can add a little bit more fight to Blade Guard. He's got his interesting stat line now, though again not really stand out versus the more standard options like say a Lieutenant. Lazarus is 70 points, and as before, I feel like his anti-psycho abilities just aren't relevant enough in enough games to justify that cost, maybe one of the very weakest of the characters. Ezekiel 75 points and gets some precision psychic and gets +1 attack for his unit. Again, seems not awful in Blade Guard, though you might want one of the characters that helps them punch up against tough stuff more. And finally, Samael's 130 points, that puts him at the same price as the Raven Wing Command Squad. And I would argue that the Raven Wing Command Squad usually add more to the unit versus Samael himself, though I guess he's a bit better balanced against them now they went up to 130 as well. Overall, just not a lot of balance on the character side of things, I think. Finally, for the Codex points, we have the Enhancements. The Company of Hunters ones range between 10 points and 30. I feel like the 3 ones, bar the Mastercrafted weapon, are all interesting ways of delivering Alpha Striking Raven Wing in their own way. It could certainly be a fairly intimidating Alpha Strike list to have 3 squads of Black Knights led up by command squads, each with one of those. For the Inner Circle Task Force, the best one is the Deathwing Assault in my opinion for the first turn Deep Strike. That is 30 points, though I still think it's worth it at that kind of cost. Getting the Terminators exactly where you need them turn 1 is very intimidating. And for the Unforgiven Task Force, I still rate the best one as the Pennant of Remembrance, 10 points for an Ancient to get a 6+ Feel No Pain. That can be pretty nice in a big chunky Terminator squad. No enormous surprises on my part for the Enhancements though. Overall, between the Dark Angels and their points, I do think that it's pretty bad for them. Fairly obvious that most of these models aren't even close to being good at these points costs, and also pretty obvious that Azrael himself is undercosted. As a result, based on these, it doesn't look like the Azrael Ironstorm, maybe with a Dark Shroud, is going to go anywhere, and that's probably still going to be one of the best ways to play Dark Angels. They're just literally throwing Azrael into a generic Space Marine list in any of the core Codex detachments is going to do fine as well. I'll be interested to see if anyone tries to make that Ravewing Black Knights and command squads in the Company of Hunters do okay. Maybe that or in the Stormlance. I feel like even if they don't seem absolutely enormously stand out, they still do some things that a bunch of units in the generic Codex Space Marines don't, and maybe that's enough to keep them interesting. In general though, I'd say that just about every other unit besides those either ranges from outright bad to just middling or underwhelming for the rest of the Codex. I still think you'd be alright using Deathwing Knights or the Terminators casually, but I'd be surprised if they're going to stand up too much to optimise tournament lists. Overall though, I do feel like I'm a bit disappointed by this one. Feels like the points cost could have been a real way to turn an underwhelming Codex into one that's kind of interesting. Things like having Inner Circle Companions at 85, good points decreases for Lionel Johnson at the Deathwing Knights and the Landspeeder Vengeance, and try and balance Azrael better versus the other characters, maybe with a nerf to him but some buffs to everyone else. I just feel like some combination of that could have been reasonably achieved, given that we're in the era of digital points now, and they must have had a fair bit of feedback as to the Dark Angels Codex, but seems like anything like that's going to be left to another balance pass. I've got no idea if this is partly being deliberate to try and make sure that the Divergent chapters don't just absolutely dominate versus the core Codex Space Marines. It's kind of a design fault for them at the moment. Dark Angels being able to access everything that the core Codex can do, but also add far more options. In any case, let me know what you think. Would you agree that the points for the Codex rules are quite as bad as I'm saying, or am I being a bit too doom and gloom about it? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. I'll hopefully aim to make a few more Dark Angels videos on the channel. I'd quite like to do a tier list and maybe a focused look at Lionel Johnson as well in the not too distant future, so feel free to subscribe and stay tuned for those. I do tend to post 40k videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.